Hello and welcome to the Indian Debating League's Motion Breakdown series, where we've been breaking down all the motions from Sofia World's 2026. My name is Krishaang, I have been your host, and this is bittersweet because it is the last part of this series. I hope everyone has enjoyed the series and has been able to take something positive away from it, irrespective of your level of experience. This will be a recurring theme in this session about your level of experience because today's topic is TH predicts motions and the round 9 motion from Sofia was 2026, which was a TH predicts motion. What is very important about TH predicts motions is, as we all know, they have one very simple burden, likelihood. They're a unique type of motion which can throw off very experienced debaters quite easily for some reason. And actually, the reason is quite simple, which is that when you're an experienced debater and you've been debating for a serious amount of time, you're going to be very used to debating in a certain way, trying to find harms and benefits and trying to attach utility values to various impacts and always trying to come up with impacts as the end goal of the debate rather than coming up with impacts to lead to something else as a part of your mechanism, which you probably have to do in TH predicts motions, as I'm going to talk about. So, what often happens for experienced debaters is that we default to our muscle memory. We default to our uh, general strategy of winning debates, and often we end up being off clash, or at least some part of our material, which we've spent a lot of time on, ends up being off clash. For novice debaters, these TH predicts motions aren't that much more of a problem than other motions because they haven't developed that muscle memory yet. So if you're a novice debater, you are probably quite likely to not have a burden issue in these TH predicts motions, at least a basic burden issue. But you still might have an issue of approach with regards to how do I prove this specific burden of likelihood. So I think this session can apply to both types of people. We're going to go over case making in this session in a very, I would say, in the same format or in the same structure as we would teach novices to make case. Um, we are going to be talking about the motion, the parts of the motion, what are not burdens of this motion, what are burdens of this motion, and then trying to fulfill those burdens. We will do this through things like identifying trends, identifying stakeholders, being able to compare and weigh them against each other, talking about feedback loops to a certain extent, and then we will try to identify how we can do everything. But first and foremost, before all of that, we will also define our key terms, which is another thing we keep asking novices to do, and will turn out to be very very handy in this specific motion. Let's get going. The motion says this house predicts that the developing world will become more rather than less democratic over the next decade. Before I get into this, I do also want to make another note on experience level. And I want to do this at the top of the session, which is about implementation. So maybe if you're a senior debater or an experienced debater, the initial effort for you to be able to bypass that muscle memory and unlearn some bad habits temporarily while debating these TH predicts motions, this initial constant checking of yourself is probably going to require a certain amount of effort. But once you do that, you will find that you will retain your same ability to be able to make case, find impacts, and do all of that kind of stuff. So it is not going to be as much of an issue once you're past the small hump. But for novice debaters, I think that there is a lot. I think this is actually very funny. So I think a TH predicts motion is the best suited type of motion where a novice debater can get an upset over a senior debater. Because if the senior debater relies on their muscle memory, more often than not, what a novice debater can do is out debate them simply by being more on clash and fulfilling the relevant burdens of this motion, even if the other team is a better executor. If that happens, then it is quite likely that you're able to bypass a lot of the good execution of the shiny dino team, and you're able to ensure that you are able to eke out a victory and definitely not take a fourth. So, being absolutely clear on what this type of burden is and immediately implementing it into habits will be able to help you form these good habits so that when you keep debating these TH predicts motions 5 tournaments, 10 tournaments from now, your new muscle memory or the foundational muscle memory that you will build with your approach to these motions will be more accurate. Okay, now let's come over to this specific motion. Um, First, what are we talking about? The developing world. What is the process that the developing world is going to undergo, which is of contestation in this debate, which is about becoming more or less democratic, and what is the time frame, which is very nice for the World Series to give us a time frame. because without time frames, these debates can get quite muddy, is over the next decade. All right. So let's first talk about what are things that are not burdens and that we don't need to focus on. Now, these are not things that you are going to get any value from. Okay, I'll be more charitable. There is some value that you can get from them, but not as much value as the time that you're going to be investing and the speech time that you're going to be investing into talking about these not burdens. So the first not burden is whether democracy is good or bad. The second not burden is whether the increase or decrease of democracy is good or bad. The third not burden, and this is something that very good debaters often do, is they try to find process harms or process benefits, whether this increase happens in good ways or bad ways. That is also not a burden. You need to eliminate the conception of good or bad before you approach these types of TH predicts motion. You need to strictly talk about how are you best able to predict that X will happen as opposed to Y happening. But in fact, I was being charitable earlier for a reason, which is that all of these not burdens are still like they're not actively venomous to think about. For example, if there is a process harm that you're able to prove, or let's say process benefit. Let's say once again in this motion, you prove that as some countries turn to democracy, this process of these countries turning to democracy is going to be good, which will inspire more countries to turn into democracies. So maybe you can use this as a part of a trend or a part of a logic chain, as I will talk about. But this should not be a way that you're trying to win this debate. But the biggest thing that you need to avoid, and the biggest kind of even mental framing and in prep framing with your friends, with your teammate, is our world, our side, their side. Because there are no real sides here. There are no different, different world assignments that are given to teams that they need to defend. The House collectively is trying to argue whether one type of world, one type of outcome of our current world is more likely than the other outcome. So both teams are actually starting at the same point. So this type of framing and this type of even this wording is something that might throw you off track and might end up wasting a large amount of your time. What are the burdens then? As we keep saying, the burden is very simple in these motions, which is to prove likelihood. You need to prove whether the event is likely or unlikely or more likely than it is unlikely, whether it is probable, whether it is certain, any of these words that are not really synonyms but point to the same thing, which is likelihood. But if you're ever confused, I think the best way that you can remember the burden of a TH predicts motion and deduce the burden of a TH predicts motion is to understand that a TH predicts motion is just a fancy way of writing a THBT motion in most cases. And I will caveat this by saying that this could be applied to a lot of motions, and THBTs are the most general motions that you could probably extrapolate others out of. But I still think that there is value in using this analogy to be able to get to the true burden of this motion. Look at this motion. This house predicts blah, blah, blah. If we replace this predicts with beliefs and make it THBT, the developing world will become more rather than less democratic over the next decade. Is that really going to change the burden? No. And you will still have to prove the same thing, which is that this event, which is more likely than the less democratic. So it's the same thing. But I think that maybe people would be able to say that there are some TH predicts motions that cannot be directly worded to THBT motions or directly analogized to THBT motions. I think they still can if you are able to add the predictive factor. For example, let's say a motion is this house predicts the widespread adoption of UBI, and we want to convert this to a THBT motion, so we're able to understand the burden. We can say that this house believes that there will be a widespread adoption of UBI. There will be, or something like that. If we make that the motion, then we will be able to deduce our burden once again. Because our burden in a THBT motion is to purely make a judgment of the truth value of the statement, more often than not than the utilitarian value or whatever, or whether something is good or bad. I mean, that is usually very explicit in certain THBT motions where there are THBT blah 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 will do more harm than good. But in most THBT motions, or the most general way to understand a THBT X motion, is that you have to prove the truth value of X. And in this case, you just have to prove the truth value of the statement, or if you're on op, you have to disprove the truth value of the statement that the developing world will become more rather than less democratic over the next decade. So I hope that this is a useful way to be able to remember this burden. And if you remember the THBT burden, you will always remember a TH predicts burden. What is the burden on gov? The developing world will become more democratic. What is the burden on op? The developing world will become less democratic. Plus the time frame. How do we really prove likelihood? This is a question which will plague all of us, and even a lot of experienced debaters. And this is often a critique that I've seen from a lot of people about why TH predicts motions are not good motions, which is that where is the depth? Lots of people say that likelihood is insufficient or an insufficient burden to spend an entire BP debate arguing about, to have 8 different speeches argue about whether this will happen or not happen. And a lot of people say that these types of motions are unfair to certain things. I say skill issue. I think that the solution here is to is to define, confine, and like uh, completely get a hold of what the burden of likelihood is, to be able to split it into different things if need be, into different sub burdens, and to also be able to identify what can contribute to this kind of likelihood. I think there's a vast amount of depth, and the way that we can start finding that depth is, once again, what do we tell our novices to do? Define your key terms. Let's define our key terms. Another thing we tell our novices to do is you don't need to define key terms that are where your definitions are unlikely to be contested within the debate. In that case, you don't define your key terms. So the first key term in this motion is the developing world. I'll just go to the motion once again for the sake of anyone who wasn't looking. Is this house predicts that the developing world. So defining this key term is not very utile, because if you it is unlikely that the definition will be challenged. Like, I think maybe there might be small disagreements about what the developing world looks like, but by and large, most people, and I'm oversimplifying here, but I'm appealing to intuition, is that most people believe that the developing world can be defined as broadly lower and middle income states. What's a lot more interesting is, what does more democratic actually mean? And here you can have strategic definitions. Like, okay, so you can come up with them in 2 ways. The first is if you have a strategy and you have a certain amount of spec or something and you want to come up with a specific type of definition, or if you want to figure out what the strategy is and come up with just a variety of different definitions. They don't even all have to be mutually exclusive, they have to be low-key mutually exclusive. But I mean, you have to minimize the intersection, you have to minimize, and you have to come up with a bunch of different definitions to see that for each definition, what would be the path to victory, what would be the method you would use to prove that likely. Let me give some examples of some definitions I could think of. The first is regime count. You could simply define that the number of countries that are democracies will increase. And there will be like, how will this happen? This will happen because there will be a conversion of the governance systems of these states over time. So this definition puts the metric of likelihood very, like, it gives us a target of what we need to prove to be likely, which is simply that in 2036, are there simply more states in the developing world that call themselves democracies than there are now? This is the simplest and most basic definition that I could think of. I think that this is not even an unfair definition. Maybe it is not as realistic, or maybe not as balanced of a definition, or maybe not. I mean, it could be strategic. Anyway, I'm going on a tangent. So, but I will tell you that there are maybe more nuanced definitions that you could have that point to more strategic paths to victory. What you could do also define more democratic as there being a higher depth or quality of democracy. So on the first definition, teams are arguing how many countries call themselves democracies. On the second definition, we say that it doesn't matter how many countries. What matters is how many countries act in democratic ways, and what is the extent of the democratic ways in which they internally act, irrespective of whatever they call themselves, irrespective of whether they call themselves a kingdom or a democracy or whatever. So you could say that are there going to be more institutions with a higher amount of power to be able to constrain the authoritarian people, or even in countries that call themselves democracies but aren't democracies, in those types of countries, is the opposition going to gain a certain amount of capacity or support or something like that, and be able to enforce something and to get a high enough balance that you could call it democracy? Does media and communication change enough? that people have free access to information and democratic access and not asymmetric access to information, whatever. So you try to bypass the first definition of regime count and leave them arguing about the number and say that we don't care about what countries call themselves. We care about how democratic they are. I don't think this completely outframes the first definition of completely. I said completely twice, but I don't think this completely outframes the first definition. And the reason that that's not true is you could still defend the first definition, and you could say that it's very arbitrary to determine what is a democracy and what is not democracy. The best metric is to go by self-identification or what other countries consider this country to be. So if most countries are in consensus that a certain country is democratic enough, then we should believe that they are democracies. So you could say that regime count is something that matters. It's the simplest and clearest way to be able to judge this debate. And if you want, you can also co-opt some of the depth and quality benefits and explain that having more countries calling themselves democracies leads to more democratic actions. Or on op, you could say less democratic actions, whatever. You get the idea. I'm doing all of this to explain to you that these definitions will never exist in a vacuum. You will have to compare and contrast these definitions against each other, identify which is most strategic for you, but also what's most strategic for the other team to use against you. The third definition that I could come up with here is durability over time. I think what you could argue is that maybe there are countries like it. I think this is more of an argument about frequency. I think is maybe the best word to use it, which is that we live in a very uncertain world, and where regime change is becoming increasingly common. Very drastic regime changes are becoming increasingly common. Like you can talk about Venezuela or Iran, or you could talk about the Gen Z protests in Nepal and Bangladesh, and even regime change in Madagascar. Like there is so much regime change, but these regimes are unlikely to be very stable, which is why the correct metric to judge this debate is over the next 10 years, what is the share that most developing countries will spend under democratic rule as opposed to under autocratic rule. So will most countries spend on average 6.5 years under democratic rule, 7 years, whatever? You don't have to assign a number to it, but you do have to basically explain the proportion of time that they're able to spend. And if democracies do get established, how durable those democracies are. Op would say that they're not durable, and Gov would say that autocracies and authoritarian governments are not durable. What you might have noticed is that these metrics are related, but they are not the same. And you can win on one and lose on another, which is fine. What you need to do is identify which definition or which metric is the most strategic one for your side. Be prepared to lose the other ones, of course, doing strong enough mitigation that if there's a judge on the panel who's trying to argue for you against another judge or defend you against another judge, and the other judge is saying, oh, but they don't say anything on the other definition, you should have some material on the other definition just to hedge your bets. But you should be comparing why this specific definition is the best definition that you can apply, especially in higher rooms where teams have different definitions, and even in lower rooms where teams often have different definitions. So pick a definition. It will help your case prep. It will give you a direction in which you need to go. It will also be able to tell you preemptively what the strategies of, or the best possible strategies of the other teams are going to be. And you'll be able to preemptively ensure that your case can interact with it sufficiently to win, basically. Yeah, let's move on to the next part. What do we do after we do definitions? Oh, it scrolled a lot. Here we go. Next thing we do is trends and stakeholder analysis. What debaters are very good at is doing structural analysis, is giving general structural reasons as to why the free market is good or the free market is bad. Monopoly is good or monopoly is bad. State good, state bad. There are a lot of, I mean, I don't even want to just call them, like, dismiss them when I call them stock. They're stock for a reason. But there are a lot of mechanisms that you can apply across different debates and they still work. These predicts motions actually place a much higher burden than a lot of other motions on grounding that structural analysis to the specific time period. In this case, the specific time period that we're saying of 2026 to 2036. So your analysis doesn't just have to be logically rigorous. It also has to be temporally relevant to the time that we live in and the time that we're likely to live in or this time period that we're likely to live through. And the way that, and this does not mean you discard structural analysis. This means that the things that you are analyzing can potentially change. So now what you're trying to analyze, as opposed to impacts and stuff, is, or principles and all of these things, is to analyze forces, is to analyze trends, is to analyze the actors that are involved in the forces and the actors that are responding to these forces. So you have to, of course, start with the world as it exists now, but you can't stop there. Your analysis has to be dynamic, and it has to consider the amount of uncertainty that can exist in the world. And your job is to prove to the judge that there is this island of certainty, which is my opinion and my team's case in this entire world of uncertainty. So there is essentially a feedback loop when it comes to stakeholders and trends. And you can see this very simply here, because there could be stakeholders who ideologically drive a trend. Then these stakeholders could shape these trends could go ahead and shape the incentives and capacities of these stakeholders. Maybe the capacities are spent, maybe they are gained, maybe more people opt in, whatever. And then the modified trend that comes, which is maybe a responsive trend or a mitigated version of this trend or a stronger version of this trend, then influences those stakeholders again. And of course, this means that there's also a bunch of other stakeholders and a bunch of other trends that play in together. So, in a nutshell, I think this is the best way to put it, which is that trends shape stakeholders' trends shape stakeholder incentives and capacities over time, but stakeholder decisions and interactions also strengthen, weaken, or redirect those trends. So trends can branch off into sub trends with a reduced amount of capacity for each trend, and a lot of different things can happen. The trends can reverse, trends can stop and stall, and a bunch of things. So the most simplistic form of analysis that you could like use as an example is that, let's say I'm Gov, so I'm saying that here's an example of a trend that strengthens pro-democratic actors. When they become strong, they convert that into democratic gains, which increases more capacity to be able to fuel this trend. So the pro-democracy trend increases or gets stronger. We will get a lot more specific about these trends, but I'm just being quite general here and talking about the most basic analysis you can do. And Op could say that this strengthens anti-democratic actors who then use that capacity to suppress the opposition, which means that the positive trend that Gov is talking about here actually gets suppressed, and then they are able to benefit more. Then here you're able to create these points of clash. And here the point of clash is very simple, which is what is the extent of suppression that these anti-democratic actors are able to do, or like basically who has higher capacity to be able to win this I mean, I can't find a better word than clash, honestly. Like, who has the higher capacity to be able to win this clash at the turning point where authoritarian countries are becoming more democratic through whatever. So that's why you have to identify stakeholders, which ones are currently strong, which ones are weak, which ones are driving this trend, which ones would benefit from this trend, and which ones would get harmed from this trend. The third thing I want to note here is with regards to divergent empowerment, which is that this motion does not restrict you to any specific country, and you should not make the mistake of restricting yourself to any specific country. You should also try to be ready for, I mean, ideally, you should incorporate that nuance into your case. But let's say you can't. You need to be ready for a higher amount of nuance entering this debate with regards to the sheer spectrum of countries that can constitute the developing countries. So, what you need to acknowledge is that same trends can have divergent outcomes in different situations. Like, let's say there is a pro women in power trend. Okay, like let's say there is a trend that is the end impact of that trend is that there are more women who are able to get political power in countries where the women who have the incentive or capacity to access this political power, where those women, sorry, are liberal or progressive, they will probably act in more democratic ways. But where the women of those countries that have the maximum incentive and capacity to access democratic power or to access like any kind of public office, when these women themselves are conservative or authoritarian, they will act in authoritarian ways. Which is why in status quo in the real world, even right now, but maybe even more a couple years ago, we were able to see a large amount of female leaders who were able to who were espousing conservative ideas, or at the very least authoritarian ideas. So you can always explain that there are trends that act in different ways in different countries, and you need to be prepared for that kind of nuance. But lastly, you should also identify who are the people who exploit this trend. So a trend may and there is a question of willfulness here, So there are going to be people who might be good actors or bad actors who are waiting for a trend to occur to be able to provide them with material or psychological benefits. These people may or may not be a part of the trend as it is. So let me give you an example. Let's say, and I mean, it doesn't have to be factual. Let's say there's a country where the LGBTQ movement is currently quite strong, and the feminist movement is also quite strong. And let's say there is currently some big protest happening about something like maybe like menstrual leaves or something. Uh, Maybe this protest about menstrual leaves, this specific event, is not something that the LGBT movement ever advocated for or contributed to. But this specific protest could end up having benefits for the LGBT community and that movement as well. Does that mean that the movement would recognize this preemptively and collaborate earlier? Or does that mean that they would be affected by those benefits and collaborate later? Or does that mean that if there are bad actors involved and non altruistic actors involved, would they just not collaborate, just purely keep exploiting these trends? So you have to identify who are the stakeholders who are best placed to directly benefit from the trend, who need to benefit from the trend, who we are apathetic to benefiting from the trend, who get harmed by the trend, and who deserve to be harmed by the trend. Like you have to identify whether the people that need this trend get it, and the people that we don't want the benefits of trend going to, those people don't get this trend. So I've been rambling, so I'll just give you this TLDR once again. Your analysis should ask two questions at the same time. Number one, what are the major trends that are likely to shape the developing world over the next decades? A decade. And number two, which stakeholders are empowered, constrained, or incentivized by those trends? And how will their responses feed back into the broader trajectory? I think we'll be able to see a bunch of examples here of many, many major trends. I won't go over them all, but this is what I'm trying to explain to you is going to be a good idea for case making. What you can do is you can just create a bunch of baskets or buckets or categories in which you can define trends. The trends that you're defining don't need to be mutually exclusive, but you need to be able to, or you ideally should be able to come up with a significant number of trends for each category and then be able to identify which ones are strong and which ones are strategic and which ones are unstrategic and also which ones are weak. So yeah, I'll just give you some examples. So for example, for socioeconomic trends, I've written things like climate stress. I've written things like urbanization and whether this is happening. And again, trends can be argued on both sides. Like urbanization, is there more migration from urban to rural areas or rural to urban areas? Rise of the domestic middle class, whether this is actually happening or whether this is not happening, or whether this is weakly happening, or is the middle class getting destroyed instead? Economic inequality, is it increasing? Is it decreasing? Anti-incumbent discontent, dissent, is this increasing? Is this decreasing? In technological trends, things like is independent, is indie media growing or declining? Is propaganda and narrative control higher, or is democratization and accurate like information higher? All of these different things, and you can talk about a bunch of things like international trends, like liberal international norms, and whether people are benefiting from them or creating backlash against them. The changing dependence on Western aid, trade, or security guarantees, whether this is happening, whether this is not happening, whether the alternative partners are likely to be pro-democratic, anti-democratic, etc., etc. In conflict, we can talk about how whether counter-terrorism frameworks are going to be used to justify more repression or not, whether border instability is increasing or decreasing, what will be the like, are we heading to a trajectory, are we heading on a trajectory of a higher amount of conflict? Will that conflict spill over? Will it be contained, etc.? So you just, and they don't, once again I keep repeating this, but they don't need to be mutually exclusive. Don't put that burden on yourself when you're in your brainstorming phase. Just identify a bunch of these trends, all trends that you can potentially think of, and then figure out which ones are strategic for you and which ones are strategic for the other side. Now let's talk about a bunch of stakeholders. I won't go over them all, but my recommendation to you, once again, is very similar to the trends thing, which is to essentially create a bunch of categories within which you can list down stakeholders, then make subcategories, and then just list down as many stakeholders as you can. For example, I've here had, I think, three total categories, which was countries, cross-border groups, and corporations slash wealthy people. And then within them, I have subcategories. So here I'm talking about the developing countries and their sub stakeholders. And you just go down, like you divide this further and further and further, and you identify as many different actors as you possibly can who can contribute to this category. For example, the bureaucracy and the civil service, the trade unions, rural voting blocks, all of these kinds of things, protest movements. And when we talk about developed countries, then aid and development agencies, then we have intelligence partnerships, then we have international election monitoring actors and human rights monitoring actors. We have MNCs that are based in developed countries, or MNCs that want to enter the market of developing countries. In cross border groups, we can have pro democracy cross border groups. So we can have like all these NGOs and indie media and activist networks. And in anti democracy groups, we can have authoritarian states. There's illicit financing networks. You have legacy political consultants. You have legacy media, all of these things. You have regional blocs and all sorts of stuff. And corporations and wealthy people. I've just thought of a few people like domestic oligarchs, or like media channel owners, or like diaspora people who live in developed countries now, or maybe like international investors and all of these things. The reason I'm saying that you should make this like list, and in reality you don't have to make such a long list. I would say that if you're able to identify like these three categories, or any three categories, and two subcategories inside all of them, you should try to have like 3 to 5 stakeholders inside each subcategory, and that will be enough. But I'm just doing this to give you an example of what can constitute a stakeholder in this type of motion. Once you're able to do all of this, you need to then mark on your sheet or whatever note taking device you're using which of these stakeholders need a benefit, which of them are contributing to a trend, which ones are strong, which ones are weak, which ones have a capacity incentive to help us, which ones have capacity to help us, them, so on and so forth. Like when I say us and them here, I don't mean gov and op. I am talking about the people who want like these pro democracy actors and these anti democracy actors, because they will be the key stakeholders that are going to be driving things. Then you need to argue how these stakeholders are influenced by other stakeholders, and so on and so forth. This is very important to do, because if you like find one very strategic stakeholder and tunnel vision on that strategic stakeholder, in a BP debate it would be quite unstrategic for you, because the other teams will accuse you of cherry picking stakeholders and not being sufficiently charitable, and they will overwhelm you with stakeholders that might be more strategic for the verdict to fall on their side. And if you're an opening, you will have no ability to defend yourself. So this exercise is also quite useful for you to be able to identify what are the most strategic stakeholders that the other team is going to try to win on. So you're able to preemptively like mitigate like the advantage that they're trying to draw from these strategic for them type of stakeholders by including that in your case prep overall. So yeah, for your case to work, you cannot just cherry pick stakeholders or just list trends. You will need to account for the major relevant actors and pressures, compare their incentives and capacities, and explain why the interaction between them produces an overall movement toward or away from democracy. Because these are the stakeholders who will constitute your trends, and they will benefit from your trends, and they will perpetuate or stop your trends, and all of these types of things. So now we can move on to the next thing that becomes very important is comparatives. And again, in this motion, no our world, their world, no benefit harm comparative. Here, the comparative is to 2026. The comparative in this debate is overall the House is trying to evaluate a change from status quo, a change from 2026. So the baseline from which both teams will operate is going to be 2026. How do you incorporate this comparativeness into your trend? The first thing you do is you identify what trends exist right now, what has been able to happen so far, what has not been able to happen so far. Figure out who are the stakeholders and main actors affected by it. How are their incentives changed? How are their capacities changed? And then how do they contribute to this trend in a positive way, in a negative way? And then weigh this against the counter trends. So you basically are looking for potentially 3 impacts that stakeholders having incentive and capacity as a consequence of the trend can have on the next level of trend, which is either these responses reinforce the trend, or they disrupt the trend, or they can reverse those trends over time. You need to identify which of these like consequences is something that you want out of any given trend feedback loop kind of idea. Let's give you some examples. So let's say on gov, and I'm going to do this in the most general way possible. Let's say we're able to identify a trend that pushes towards democratic opening. Then you can explain why this trend of more democratic opening is going to reduce the capacity of the anti-democratic people and improve the capacity of the opposition people. I've written a very specific way in which this does this. So it worsens the capacity of the anti-democratic or authoritarian people by by weakening income. Sorry, by weakening incumbents, by fragmenting elite control, and by raising the cost of repression. And I've also written why this will increase the capacity of the pro-democratic people, because it will increase the coordination of opposition. This is only an example, by the way. Who are the people who will benefit from this increased opposition coordination? What is this going to lead to? Who are the people who are going to benefit from the fragmentation of elite control? Who are the people who are going to benefit from the weakness of the incumbents? And what will they do with that benefit? Are they going to contribute to this trend? Are they going to branch off a trend? What are they going to do? And the first question that other teams are likely to ask you here is, if these people had the incentive all along to do this, why did they not do this? If they wanted to do this the whole time, if the feminist movement always wanted there to be like equal voting rights for men and women, then why did they just not get it done in countries where they couldn't get it done until the 90s? Like, if that's all they wanted, when they did have a certain amount of power. So you have to spend a lot of time in explaining the margin between the incentives, but in this specific case, more the margin between the capacity. You need to explain what these stakeholders are then able to do that they previously could not. And again, remember our comparative. Our comparative is to 2026. So you explain that until 2026, what is something that these stakeholders were unable to do, and why were they unable to do the thing that our side wants them to do. And then you weigh your case, and then you weigh, so then you weigh your definition, then you win on your definition, and then you explain why your definition matters. On op, let's say we've been able to identify a trend that goes towards authoritarian capacity increasing or democratic capacity reducing. Here, authoritarian capacity in one way is increasing because there's more resilience to change. So the impacts of this could be that it strengthens the people who are incumbent, it strengthens security actors, it strengthens the elites who don't want more democracy. What is this strengthening leading to? Who is benefiting from this? If they always wanted to do, and here on op it's going to be more difficult to prove the capacity delta, so you have to spend some time on it, which is, if these stakeholders are now going to contribute to the perpetuation of this trend, and are going to do more for this trend, what are they now going to do that they could not, and why could they not do it earlier? And then you can impact this, adjust it to your definition, and then explain as to why this wins the round. So how do you actually weigh these feedback loops against each other? And the answer is, you just use your traditional weighing metric. Because at the end of the day, you're still just comparing arguments, and you're comparing logic and rigor from teams. So first, you can say that a particular feedback loop of a particular strength is strong, a particular trend is strong. You could say that even if our feedback loop is not that strong, it affects more people in scale and affects more countries. Or you could say that there is a higher perpetuation of the trend. Maybe sometimes it becomes strong, maybe sometimes it becomes weak, but it still continues to exist until 2036 and does not get wiped out. So, or in the best case, it is able to multiply and spread a lot to different countries. So you have to be able to identify which metric of the other team is likely going to weigh their feedback loop on, and then you want to identify either why that metric doesn't matter or why you're actually able to win on that metric. And you need to also ensure that you are choosing the correct possible metric for your feedback loop. So a few examples here: a weak trend that affects many places can sometimes lose to a strong trend affecting fewer but more politically important states. Why? Because when we are trying to weigh strength versus scale, then they could say that, oh, these politically important states lead to more perpetuation of this loop, which means that there is more spread of the trend that we want in terms of pro-democracy or anti-democracy or whatever. So you can sometimes break the deadlock between two different metrics by introducing a third metric. A strong trend that appears briefly and still fizzles out may lose to a slower but self-reinforcing one. And a trend may look very, very like that. This is the same thing, which is that a strong trend can look very nice and cool, but if it can't be sustained and if it creates too much resistance, then it might not exist. So again, you just have to use correct metrics, maybe beyond these metrics, and compare your argumentation of your trends versus the trends on their side. If you are able to do this preemptively in prep, your life will be good. Now let's come to some sample cases that I've made. Of course, these cases might not be perfect, but I think that they are a way for a team to win on a particular definition that we talked about while including the feedback loop stuff that we were just including. So let's assume that opening government and opening opposition in the debate are operating on definition one or metric one, which is the number of countries or the number of developing countries that are democratic. By 2036, are there more developing states that can plausibly be called democracies than there are now? So, what could OG say? OG could say that there are a bunch of hybrid regimes in the developing world that experience democratic opening, and they can give some sort of trend based event for this, that maybe there was an opposition victory somewhere in crucial that was possible, or this time elections were fair, or something like that. I don't know. And there can be a bunch of trends that can contribute to this, like generational pressure, urbanization. There's being very, very like tough on crime, not tough on crime, but like very pressing dissent too much is a higher cost. Maybe elites are fragmenting. Maybe the public is growing. This is the first thing as generational pressure, but you get the idea. Also, there could be international pressure to democratize. One more important trend to consider here in this opening government case of more people, more countries calling themselves democracies is appeasement. So, when all of this stuff is happening, when there is so much generational pressure and anger, and there is international pressure to democratize so you can opt in into various bilateral agreements and stuff, get recognized by enough countries, then how would you choose to appease them? In the worst case, there would at least be enough pressure for these authoritarians to tokenistically concede to a democratic self-identification. In the best case, they will obviously have higher concessions. There will be some intensity of democracy also, but at the very least, they will. This amount of pressure is enough to push them over the line. What can, if opening opposition attacks by saying that there are countries that will go the other way and will become non-democratic, then you weigh that by explaining that there are fewer democracies that fall out of the category than non-democracies that enter this category. What could O do here? O does not have to have this burden of saying the entire world becomes autocratic. It's just that these countries fall, like the number of these countries fall. And the reason that this mainly happens, and the mechanism through and the trend that you have to analyze that happens, is a frequency of coups and democratic backsliding, and them spilling over into other countries and creating that kind of trend. And support this idea with a bunch of trends, such as authoritarian adaptation to forms of dissent raising, to increased surveillance, to elite consolidation, and you're clashing here, elite consolidate, elite fragment, to this international pressure, whether this is strong or whether this is weak, etc., etc. Let's find a way to be able to interact between the OG case and O case so that you can also see how weighing works in terms of likelihood. Um, Opening government says that this entire thing will happen because of appeasement, in the sense that countries will change their definition from kingdom of blah 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 to democratic republic of blah blah blah. The clash then becomes, does this appeasement actually exist? Op could argue, if Op is a very strong team, that there is an insufficient reason for this kind of appeasement to even happen. Maybe it could be that like these elites are already too strong. Maybe it could be that like no, there simply isn't enough capacity to demand as much appeasement, or maybe this appeasement just happens in other ways. Which is what I want to talk about in the next thing, which is that I mean, I was rambling a bit, but like I think O has to concede that there will be some appeasement. But what O can then argue about is whether what will be the extent of this appeasement and mode of this appeasement. Will the appeasement to the public or to these international countries happen in the form that opening government wants it to happen on, which is becoming a democratic, changing your self-identification as a country to a democratic country? Is this the most likely way in which this happens, or is this not the most likely way in this a likely way in which this happens? And if the extent of appeasement or the need for the extent of appeasement is quite low, then maybe things never get to this point, and there are lower forms of appeasement. Maybe there are different forms of appeasement, but does this happen in this way or not? So Gov will have to defend as to why the appeasement that the authoritarians need to do to the pro-democratic actors happens in this specific way and not in all of the alternative ways in which it could happen. Like at least why it is more likely to happen in this way than all of these alternatives. Let's talk about definition 2. And let's believe that in this debate now, closing government and closing opposition are operating on the second definition, which is the extent of democracy inside developing countries. What is the quality of democracy inside these developing countries? So, and here maybe closing half is trying to outframe top half. Closing half is saying that it is very uncertain or unknown to us how many countries actually will flip or reflip or what will happen. And maybe this is too high of a barrier, some teams could say, or maybe it's too low of a barrier of having self-identification. Just a TLDR, just calling yourself a democracy does not mean that the developing world has become more democratic. The question is, irrespective of what these countries call themselves, are they behaving in more democratic ways than they are now? Now, as in 2026. Once again, that is the comparative of this debate. So, closing gov could say that maybe it's very uncertain or unlikely that countries flip very cleanly from non-democracy to democracy, but maybe there are more democratic rights that start to exist within these countries. So, and these are the things that you would argue for, the impacts that will help perpetuate your trend towards 2036. Freer and fairer elections, more ability to organize for opposition voices, more independence of media, judiciary, electoral bodies, check and balances on incumbents, etc. These are impacts that you're going to aim for, even if not in the first cycle, but in the second or third cycle, as the capacity of your chosen stakeholder increases. What trends could you use here? You could talk about more political awareness. You could talk about more civil society capacity. You could talk about how people would rather co-opt democratic things and say that we were doing them all along, as compared to admit to themselves and to the world that they were not truly a democracy, or that certain aspects of a democracy which are considered to be desirable do not also apply in their quote unquote perfect sorts of governance systems. So even if the let's say number of countries in this democracy bucket does not increase dramatically, the average quality of democracy probably ends up increasing. The main thing that actually will become relevant here when we weigh this against closing opposition is about the public reaction to war and instability. In this specific case, all I want you guys to remember before we jump into CO is that we are saying that all of these things that are going to cause the impacts that we want, that will perpetuate our trends, these things will happen as a consequence of something that's not happened so far in 2026. What is that something that has not happened so far? What is the trigger point or the tipping point for this trend to accelerate? Or is it just on the tipping point of accelerating, or of having these changes already, which I don't think is the best way to argue if that's what you were thinking. So what is the reason that this tipping point has been reached? And closing government can argue that the world is becoming more and more uncertain, which means that people's expectations of their states are higher, and people are more paranoid about whether they will be able to live tomorrow and be able to go to their work, their regular job tomorrow, and their children will still be able to go. For the average citizen in developing countries that can be hit the hardest by rising instability. Because of this, they have an incentive to introduce more check and balances. They have an urgency to introduce more check and balance. And then you have the impacts that we actually want that perpetuate our stuff. What can CO say? CO can say that, and again, these two types of countries, right? There's countries that call themselves democratic and don't call themselves democratic. They can say that first, countries that don't call themselves democratic will backslide even more and become more authoritarian. And the countries that call themselves democratic will start to backslide. And could look like many things, like, for example, elections still happening but becoming less fair, opposition parties becoming mostly nominal, or in being more charitable than just facing a lot of harassment or structural disadvantages, and these institutions that CG wants to use for accountability becoming increasingly captured, becoming increasingly weaker, etc., etc. So countries can remain nominally democratic while becoming much less democratic in practice. Now, what are we comparing this to? We're comparing this to 2026. What is the tipping point here? We are saying that there are a bunch of trends: democratic backsliding, institutional capture, there's propaganda, but these are all trends that will contribute to the direction of change. What is the tipping point for why this has not happened so far in 2026? And here is the interaction that I want to introduce between CG and CO, which is, how does the public react to war and instability? If you saw in the trends, I included this trend of public tolerance for illiberalism in insecure contexts. What this means is, basically the CO is trying to argue that since times are so uncertain, the public just wants a strongman leader, and this strongman leader is likely to be authoritarian, so they're okay with giving away their rights in exchange for more security. That's the idea. So they're okay with a certain amount of democratic backsliding. This is basically directly in contestation to what CG is saying, which is that these people will take over, or at least dissent against the authoritarians. How do we then clash both teams? We can clash both teams on one thing. Because who is the actor that is really involved in this clash? There's two actors. The first is the public, the second is the incumbent. What, and we have considered both on CG and CO that there is a war and this is a time of grave uncertainty where people are insecure. If this is the conceded frame and this is the actor, which is the common public, and then the difference becomes in how the common public perceives the second actor, which is the incumbent. Which is to say that does the common public perceive the incumbent to be competent enough to deserve the reduction in civil liberties and to deserve getting more power? Are we putting our lives in safe hands? Are those hands safe? So the clash then becomes on the public perception of the competence of the authoritarian leader to be able to bring them out of the crisis. And this competence needs to be evaluated on comparative with the alternatives, with the opposition parties that we are talking about, that start to rise and they start to get more room to organize, that start to collaborate more amongst themselves and stuff. So does the and here you will obviously require a certain amount of spec to be able to argue, and if you don't have it then you might be able to deduce from first principles, but I highly recommend having a lot of spec if you're going this deep into this type of clash, because you will have to give specific examples of cases where people have been okay with authoritarian power and explain why that authoritarian person was, I don't know, was perceived to be competent, and how this can apply to present leaders and why they are likely perceived to be competent already, or as the war escalates they'll be perceived to be more competent or whatever. I think I went on a bit of a ramble there, but the idea is generally just to say that you need spec, you need to know how people react to stuff, you need to know how people in developing countries in uncertain, in insecure situations, what sorts of traits they value, and you need to know who the incumbents in these developing countries are and whether they sufficiently espouse those traits or not, especially in comparative to opposition leaders or to alternatives that could potentially espouse those traits. You identify what traits people value and you see whether these people have same traits or not. When you do this, you are going to be able to weigh against the other team because you've taken down the main mechanism through which these authoritarian countries can become more authoritarian, or more importantly, quote unquote democratic countries can become more authoritarian, which is by the incumbents using emergency power and the public being okay with it. We prove that the public is not okay with it, then debate is likely to go in CG's favor. We prove that the public is okay with it, debate is likely to go in CEO's favor. So yeah, that's about it for this session and for this series. I hope that you've taken something positive away, irrespective of your level of experience. But thank you very much for following along with the series, and I wish you the best. Happy debating.